Hello and welcome to Since Attlee and Churchill, the podcast about British political history since the Second World War. I'm Lee Evans, the historian of the Conservative Party.
And I'm Richard Johnson, the historian of the Labour Party, and Lee's husband. In this midweek episode, we'll be doing something a little bit different. We'll be looking at the key political events of 2025 that we think will have an impact on politics in Britain in 2026.
Before we come on to that, just a couple of parish notices. One of them is to thank everybody who listened to the podcast in 2025. We've been really thrilled with the response and the growing number of people who have been listening to us week by week. We've had growth figures that Rachel Reeves, in fact, any chancellor in recent British history would have been delighted to have. So thank you so much to everybody who has listened. If you've enjoyed listening to the show, well, we hope you'll stick with us in 2026. And we'd also be very grateful if you would leave us a positive review wherever it is you get your podcasts from. If you tell your friends about us, if you think they might enjoy listening to Since Attlee and Churchill as well. And also, new for 2026, there is a Patreon, which you can now join, which gives you access to ad-free listening, including integration with Spotify, bonus episodes of the podcast, some additional extras as well. And among other things, it's a really great way to support the work that we're doing on the podcast if you've enjoyed listening. You can find a link to the Patreon in the show notes for this podcast, and we hope you'll take a look. But Richard, to get us started on this episode, why don't you kick us off?
Well, I think the most dramatic image of 2025 in British politics was the image of the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rachel Reeves, streaming in tears on the front bench, on the Treasury bench in the House of Commons, sat behind the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, during Prime Minister's questions in July of this year. Now, the official line was we were told that Rachel Reeves was suffering some kind of personal episode, and that may be true, but I think it's also really quite possible that Rachel Reeves just felt out of her depth. This was after a very significant U-turn on welfare reform and welfare cuts. And in the wider context of a government that was consistently failing at its key basically its key election promise, which was that it was going to be the government that delivered growth, and it was going to deliver growth by following Rachel Reeves' rigid fiscal rulebook. And in spite of attempts to follow that rulebook, we haven't seen really much notable growth in this country at all. The reason I raised this moment is not simply because it was a very dramatic moment in of itself, but because I think it was a missed opportunity for Keir Starmer to do something that could make a big difference for the Labour government going forward, and that is to change the Chancellor. Now, people often say in kind of contemporary British politics that you cannot change a Chancellor. And part of that, I think, is because we have become accustomed to the idea of these Prime Minister Chancellor duos of Cameron Osborne or Blair Brown and so on, and that prime ministers who have changed their chancellors, like Liz Truss had to change Kwasi Kwarteng for Jeremy Hunt, or even when Boris Johnson saw the change of his chancellor, Sajid Javid, for Rishi Sunak in 2020, these were seen as bad signs, perhaps terminal signs for the future of the government, at least the Kwarteng one, maybe less so the Javid Sunak one. But I want to make the case that actually, if you take a slightly longer view of British post-war political history, you can see that actually it can be a good idea to change a chancellor midway or at some point during the parliament, i.e. you don't have to wait for a general election to change your chancellor. I can think of two important examples from Labour history. The first is when Clement Attlee replaced his chancellor, Hugh Dalton, for Stafford Cripps in 1947. And a lot of people talk about that episode in the context of Hugh Dalton leaking the contents of a budget shortly before he gave the budget, and the fact that he'd leaked the budget to a journalist was what precipitated his resignation as Chancellor. I actually don't think that's quite right. Of course, that was the pretext for his resignation, but if you look at the immediate response of the opposition, Winston Churchill and the Conservatives, there wasn't actually a great deal of pressure on Dalton to resign. Dalton actually received words of support from Winston Churchill in the chamber when it became known that this journalist had breached the Chancellor's confidence and had leaked parts of the budget. I think the reason why Attlee replaced the Chancellor was that Attlee needed a new Chancellor to drive an economic policy shift in his government. And that, we can't go into the details of it right now, but that was in effect a recognition that the economic conditions that the government had been elected on in 1945 were no longer the economic conditions that the government was facing in 1947, namely that the government had to take out a loan from the Americans in 1946. This had put all kinds of different pressures in terms of the government's monetary policies, which then had implications for the fiscal policy. We'll probably do an episode on that at some point. The gist of it was that the Attlee government had to take a more austere fiscal policy. And Attlee needed Cripps, Stafford Cripps, to lead that policy because Stafford Cripps was able to steer an austere fiscal policy, but he had credibility of being someone who was on the left of the party. I mean, this is a man who had been expelled from the Labour Party for fraternizing too much with the communists, who had written books that praised the Soviet system. And so Attlee saw this as a really important personnel change to drive through a policy change. And the other example I just mentioned quickly is the example of the swap that Harold Wilson did in 1967, where when the government had to devalue the pound, Wilson swapped out his Chancellor Jim Callaghan and put in his place Roy Jenkins. Jenkins had been Home Secretary, he'd been a successful Home Secretary, and Callaghan and Jenkins were actually of quite different social policy views, even though they were both on the right of the party. But Callaghan had made it a sort of conviction that he wouldn't devalue. And when it became clear he had to devalue, Wilson changed personnel. And I think if Keir Starmer wanted a minimally disruptive change, he could have done something like Wilson did. He could have taken the Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, and put her in as Chancellor, and he could have taken the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, and made her the Home Secretary. He could have done something bolder than that if he wished to do so. Clement Attlee changed chancellors again later in his government, where he switched out Stafford Cripps, who, to be fair, was dying, with younger blood, and that was Hugh Gaitskell. And Hugh Gaitskell hadn't even served in the cabinet. His first cabinet job was chancellor. So that was really quite a dramatic move. But what I'm saying is that actually it is possible for a prime minister to change the chancellor. Harold Wilson changed chancellor just 1 year after that 1966 landslide. You know, it was a similar position in the timeline of the 1966 to 70 government as we are from the timeline of the 2024 2 ? Government. So you can do it fairly early, you can do it late, and you can make a big change, you can make a small change, but you can change the chancellor. And I think Starmer could have used that as an opportunity to say, actually, the Rachel Reeves rules are not working. We're going to have to make a change. There are external factors which have caused that, the election of Donald Trump, the situation here, there, and everywhere. I'm committed to delivering growth, but we need a new agenda to deliver growth. This is my woman or man to do that. But Starmer refrained from doing that. And the fact that he's refrained from doing that, I think, will be to his detriment in the year to come.
When we're thinking about a chancellor and who is the chancellor, yes, we're partly thinking about it in terms of what is the impact on the UK economy, which of course is difficult to really interpret and multifaceted and hard to know. But in this case, we're particularly thinking about it, I think, in terms of what is the impact on Starmer's leadership. And so what this brings to mind for me is when we look back through history about what do the very effective prime ministers and very effective leaders manage to do, I think they have the capacity to, in one sense, be the team leader, the coach almost of their cabinet and of their government, but in a slightly different sense, to also be the referee. So it's as if they're sat at the top of government with the different secretaries of state and ministers looking after different portfolios. And yes, of course, they're bound to the collective decision making, but they also have this slight sense of detachment, I think, from what goes on in individual departments, including the Treasury, which gives them the scope to not necessarily take on the blame for everything that goes wrong within government, and also to be seen as intervening when things do go slightly wrong to set them right, and at times adjudicating between the different contests that are going on between different cabinet ministers with slightly different agendas. What I think has ended up happening for Keir Starmer is he now seems intimately connected to Rachel Reeves and the question of her chancellorship, because he has not managed to establish that slight detachment from her and her policies. So I agree with you in principle. I think it is possible perfectly possible, of course, for a prime minister to sack or move a chancellor. It's happened a great many times. I do now wonder, though, whether or not the prime minister's position is so weak, given the deep concerns of his colleagues about his ability to carry on and certainly his ability to win the next general election, that if Rachel Reeves were to go, for example, being sacked by the prime minister, would that be seen now as the wheels coming off because his position is so weak that he almost can't afford to lose her, which ultimately backs up your point that he should have done it in 2025 because you may not actually get the chance to do it in 2026.
Okay, so Lee, what was the standout event of 2025 for you that you think will make an impact on 2026?
Well, I think if we were to say which party has had the best 2025, most of us would say Reform UK, in the sense that the 2025 is the year in which they topped the polls and stayed there. Although their Reform UK polling position has diminished in the last month or so. And I think there are a great many question marks about this idea that some people in Reform have that Farage is the messianic figure in British politics and he's storming his way into number 10. I have great doubts about whether or not that is true, let alone whether or not that would be a good thing. But nevertheless, 2025 has been an incredibly successful year for Reform UK in terms of their polling position, in terms of their membership figures, and in terms of making themselves look like they're a viable party of potentially even government in the UK, which has never before been true for a Farage-led party. But what I did want to comment upon is maybe the thing that for me is most important that didn't happen in 2025, which could have an impact in 2026. So what didn't happen is that Nigel Farage did not make Richard Tice his quote unquote shadow chancellor. And I think this is important for several reasons. One of them, that if we look at the 5 people who were elected as Reform MPs at the last general election, only 3 of them are in the party today. There's Farage himself as leader. There's Lee Anderson, who Lee Anderson has merits, I'm sure. Most people would not say he is a viable spokesperson on economic affairs. And then there's Richard Tice. Now, Richard Tice does have a background in finance and economics. It's seemingly something he is very interested in. And whilst it's not possible for Reform UK to put together a full shadow cabinet, they've lost 2 MPs, they've gained 2 MPs, one from a defection, one from a by-election win, and there's still only 5 of them. It's not possible for them to have a full shadow team. I did wonder whether or not 2025 would be the year when Farage went from being quite an authoritarian leader of the parties that he's been in charge of to something which looks a bit more like it could be a viable future government in waiting. I think the first thing that you would look to do if you're going to try and take a step in that direction is to give a title to somebody as your chief economic spokesperson within Reform UK. That didn't happen this year. And that signals to me that one of the challenges that Farage has of turning a party that is still widely seen, correctly I think, as a one-man band with followers into a potential future government. I don't yet think Farage is making that necessary step. That would be required.
Well, I would say generally, Farage's centralisation of power in the parties that he's led, UKIP, Brexit Party, Reform, has on balance been a strength rather than a weakness for those parties. But I think the reason why it's been a strength is that Farage is very good at party as coalition management. And if you understand that political party leadership is about coalition management, then what you also understand is that what you need to do is to emphasize the issues that unite the members of your coalition and suppress the issues that cause disunity among the members of your coalition. And this is true of successful parties throughout history. And Farage understands that what unites his parties is immigration and questions of national sovereignty and, broadly speaking, questions about more traditional or as they would call it, non-woke social policies. But where there are divisions within his coalition is on economic policy.
Mm-hmm.
And by putting someone like Richard Tice, who's quite clearly identified or historically has been identified with a particular economic approach, which I would say is right-wing economic Thatcherism, it would force Farage to take a stand, in a sense, on economic policy. So by avoiding doing that, he continues to suppress, for a large part, reforms association with any particular economic outlook. And when I say economic outlook, I mean questions of redistributive taxation, higher taxation, lower taxation, the size of the welfare state, questions of public ownership, and so on. He allows all kinds of ambiguity and shapeshifting on that. And by keeping him at the fore of all of that, he manages to keep the issues that he's associated with, which also happen to be the issues that his coalition agrees with amongst themselves, center stage. How sustainable that is as we get closer to election is a different question. But it probably, I think, it probably will be his strategy going up as close to election as possible to suppress those more divisive issues. And I mean divisive in terms of divisive within his own party coalition.
I agree with your analysis, and that when Farage has been leading either single issue parties or parties that effectively operated as protest votes in the British political system, I think that has been to his advantage for sure. But the challenge is now that immigration will be an issue, a big issue in the next general election. But actually, it could be an issue of declining salience in the coming years because the forecasts of net migration into the UK are that it will fall dramatically. Even going into a general election campaign, there will be big questions about the economy and the wider kind of impression of what the different parties are going to do if they get into number 10 and number 11. And he will have to have answers to those questions. I don't think he can fudge those questions forever. And I think the sooner he tries to provide some answers to those questions, rather than to chuck himself into the run-up to a general election campaign and suddenly find that he's got to put together a manifesto, he's got to answer journalist questions, and suddenly there will be reform people who feel blindsided by the fact that quite late on he's coming up with a policy agenda on something as important as the economy that they're not really prepared to accept. I think sometimes you need to begin to broaden out that sense of having a team that's across multiple issues, not just single issues that are very good for your party, and that you've got an agenda that encompasses more aspects of what the government does. But that will be a huge test for Farage and Reform next year and in the years ahead.
I see what you're saying, but I think I disagree because I think that you can actually bounce people in the short campaign into, there's some risks and costs with that, and you saw that with, say, Theresa May and her social care reforms. You've got to be careful about it, but I think there's a sense when you're in the heat of the campaign and then the focus is about the other parties and you've got people who've already committed themselves for a longer period with reform, then actually you may be able to get them to swallow certain things on economic policy, whereas if you've given them a longer period to chew over, there'd be more opportunity for people to see that they can fight each other inside the party rather than to focus on fighting outside, fighting the other parties. And the counterexample I'll give to you is your party, the Jeremy Corbyn Zara Sultana party. Zara Sultana is dreadful with internal party coalition management. She's sort of the supreme example of what not to do. She, rather than focus, as that party could have done, on the issues that united them, which namely would have been uh, British foreign policy, a non-interventionist British foreign policy, a pro-Palestinian, anti-Israeli foreign policy approach, and also questions of economic policy. What does Zara Sultana force as an issue in the conference that set up your party? But the kind of social issues like trans rights and even abortion came up in some of these debates, which splits their coalition, which is a coalition of the radical left and working class Muslims. And there's a lot that the radical left and working class Muslims could agree on foreign policy and economic policy. But instead, Zara Sultana makes it an article of faith that they have to come to a position on trans issues, when actually a wiser party management approach would have basically been to put those issues aside and say, well, we'll solve those questions when it comes to the general election. But what we're really going to focus on is how we don't like Western involvement in support for Israel. And we really want high taxation and a large welfare state. So I think if you look at who's a good party leader, an effective party leader, effective manager of the party, you've got to say it's Nigel Farage, much more so than Zara Sultana.
Yes, I think that's undoubtedly true. The implosion of your party that you've discussed there has been one of the standout moments, really, of 2025. Clearly, what happened within the year was that a space and a vacuum opened up to the left of the Labour Party, where there was a desire to see arguments that were not being heard in government, were not being heard within Labour anymore, by the 10, 15% of the country who are quite radically progressive and left-wing on lots of issues. I think most people thought for quite a long time that would be filled by the Corbyn splinter. But then what happened alongside their failure to get off the ground and their fisticuffs in Liverpool was the election of Zach Balansky as leader of the Green Party. I have many doubts about the way in which he's going about leading the Green Party, not least the fact that lots of the environmental issues that I think a Green Party can influence a debate on is not really being heard by Zach Balansky in favour of just really, in some cases, quite extreme economic positions, but that's by the by. What he is very good at doing is communicating to that 10 to 15% of radical left-wing opinion in Britain. And so he has filled that vacuum that Corbyn and your party had there for the taking and completely failed to occupy. A quick thought, though, on whether or not those two parties will coexist. We've spoken in recent months about some of the changing geography of politics in the United Kingdom, of course, of multi-party politics and the way in which smaller parties will try and focus their energies to get MPs elected at by-elections or the next general election. And there is an argument to say that, yes, whilst your party has imploded and the Greens are doing very well, that they may now just find themselves speaking actually to very different parts of the country, both geographically and ideologically. And your party may in fact end up being basically the functional organisation for what has often been described as the Guards of Independent candidates in 2024. And the Green Party instead become just a much more kind of radical, progressive Corbynista agenda that's focused much more on radical younger voters in urban metropolitan areas and so on. So there is a possibility that whilst your party has tanked and the Greens are doing quite well, that they end up talking to quite different people who sit in various different ways to the left of the Labour Party in a way that actually both do remain viable parties or operations at the next election with parliamentary representation as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I would imagine will happen, at least where we're sitting right now, is that the Green Party will take the liberal left vote, particularly younger and the older middle class educated liberal left, off. That'll mostly come to Labour's detriment, a bit creamed off the Lib Dems as well. And they may make some breakthroughs in affluent, educated constituencies. And when I say educated, I just mean people with more degrees. It doesn't mean that they're cleverer. It's often the opposite, in my view. And I think your party its future is less optimistic. I think your party risks going down the way of, say, Tusk, the Trade Union Socialist Coalition, which was a hard left party that was an attempt to try and take on the Labour Party from the left about a decade ago. It's a lot of the same type of people, kind of Socialist Workers' Party, Tusk, Socialist Unity people. I think they'll remain the core contingent, and I think the Muslim working class bit of your party, which numerically I think is the much larger part of that party, will probably go their own way. And they will probably, I think, follow something similar to the approach they took in the last general election of independent candidates, or a loose coalition of candidates who are there to represent a large segment, I think, of the British Muslim community. And I think they will do quite well. I think they could do even better than they did the last general election, even though we'll be further away from the kind of immediate sense of the Israel-Gaza war, presumably. But they'll be more coordinated. Voters in those constituencies will have an even greater sense of their strength. I think a real test for that in 2026, which is obviously what we're trying to think about rather than 2028-9, is the London borough council elections, where all of the borough councillors in London will be up for election, and we will see in different parts of London how the Greens do and how independents do, and whether there is any your party success. And I think that will give us then some read as to where there might be vulnerable constituencies to these different groups as we think ahead to the general election.
Pivoting from one of Britain's newest political parties to its oldest, I did want to say a little bit about the Conservative Party, and particularly the leadership of Kemi Badenoch. I will declare us an interest in that I'm actually an admirer of Kemi Badenoch. I voted for her in the internal election for her to be leader of the Conservatives. And I had quite a bit of confidence, actually, that she would be an interesting person to lead the party, and quite different in her approach, which is what I thought the Conservative Party probably needed after the 2024 general election. A couple of signs, I think, that things are going quite well for the Conservative Party under her leadership. But really, in the last couple of months, what I think we've begun to see is a more coherent message building around Kemi Badenoch, a much greater confidence from her and of the people around her in her leadership. And the moment which, in the middle of the year, people used to talk up as being the moment of crisis for Kemi Badenoch this year, which was in November, when the immunity period that is offered under Conservative leadership rules, where any letters that are sent in to the chairman of the 1922 committee demanding a confidence vote in the leader, something we had, of course, in 2018 on Theresa May, in 2022 in Boris Johnson, and thinking about opposition way back when in 2003 in Ian Duncan Smith. In the middle of the year, people spoke about that as if it was almost an inevitability, that come November, there would be this flood of letters that went in. In fact, Reform UK tweeted out a meme in November on the anniversary of Kemi Badenoch's election as party leader of a scene from the Harry Potter movie with all these letters sort of flowing around the room. But there's not even been a rumour that there are many letters in at all. I think we should read into that actually the appetite for a change at the top within the Conservative Party is very, very low. It's now the case that you need a third of MPs to write in to request a leadership ballot or a confidence vote. It used to be the case that you needed just 15%. When it was 15%, you would often get rumours running wild in the newspapers long before the threshold was actually hit. We haven't heard those rumours. The actual triggering point is now more than double what it used to be. So I think we can assume in the coming year that barring some total catastrophe that is unforeseen at the moment, i.e. worse than just disappointing results in the May local elections, that Kemi Badenoch's leadership of the party is secure.
Yeah, I think she has had a good year, and I, in different ways from you, have thought that she has been an underrated leader of the opposition. There was a period of time earlier this year when I was talking to some more conservative supporting people who were saying that she was no good, that she'd have to go, and people were thinking once this safety net had been removed from her, that she would be taken out with the no confidence process of the Conservative leadership rules. And of course, that hasn't materialized. I think part of it is she has improved in the job. I think she was, to be quite honest, and I don't mean this in a patronizing way, because it's not an easy thing to do. It's the toughest job in politics. Harold Wilson always said that being leader of the opposition was tougher than being prime minister. But I think she started with a certain degree of nervousness in the job, and she's built her confidence in recent months. And you can see that in her Commons performance, but also just her general media appearances, the interviews that she does, her speaking style in public, and so on. Of course, she has an enormous mountain to climb, not only having lost an election, but her party now having this huge challenge from Reform on the right. So she has to deal with both Labour and Reform. And in that respect, a point that you've made to me, Lee, offline, is that really the Conservatives need immigration to decline in salience, and the economy has to take center stage. And that clicks in with what I said earlier about the Reform coalition is divided over the economy, is united on immigration. If you can decrease the salience of immigration and increase the salience of the economy, that gives the Conservatives an opportunity to carve out a distinctive voice, and in a way that would split Reform. It's extremely difficult to lose an election and then to go back into government. But thinking about a historical example, at the moment we're doing in our main podcast, our Sunday podcast, a series on the Heath versus Wilson elections. And 1970 to 1974 is one of those rare examples in British politics where you had a party that lost power and then gained power at the subsequent general election. And what I can think of in that circumstance is that basically the country in 1970 thought that Labour had done a bad job managing the economy. And then they thought the Conservatives did an even worse job managing the economy after Labour. And then in the February 1974 election, really what happened is the country punished the Conservatives. Labour was the main beneficiary of that, but actually a third party, the Liberal Party, disproportionately, or I should say, proportionately did much, much better as a result of that. And Labour squeaked in and came back into power, not really because people had fully forgiven Labour, I think, for their sense that things hadn't gone so well in particularly 68, 69, but just because they thought that the Conservatives had done even worse. And I wonder, one way of looking at this is the Conservatives' path to government a scenario in which, yes, the country's really angry with the Conservatives, but then Labour does even worse in the public's mind on key metrics like the economy and immigration. And then Labour is punished, and yes, Reform benefits from that, but not to the extent that actually it prevents the Conservatives from squeaking back in one way or another. So there are lots of different possible futures ahead of Kemi Badenoch and the Conservative Party, but that probably is her best chance. And at the moment, I think she's putting the Conservative Party in a position to not at least foreclose that possibility for the Conservative Party, which is probably about as good as you can get as a leader of the opposition 18 months after your party suffered a landslide defeat. That brings me on to thinking about reflecting on the general performance of the Labour government of 2025. I think one thing that's become clear to us in 2025 is that this is a government that seems cursed to pursue policy in a way that maximizes political costs and minimizes governing gains. And what I mean by that is that the Labour government has made a variety of announcements on policies that were tough decisions to make, that annoyed different parts of the electorate. But you might be able to justify them on the grounds that they would bring some kind of wider governing benefit. And then the Labour Party reverses course on the policy. So it doesn't even get the, in many of these instances, fiscal benefit that it thought it was going to get. But in the minds of the public, it's been associated with that negative policy and doesn't get credit for reversing the policy that the public didn't like Labour adopting. So there are 4 policies that I can think of, major policies where the government has done this. One is the cuts to the winter fuel payment. A second is the cuts to welfare. And relatedly to that, the 2-child benefit cap. The third is the introduction of inheritance tax for farms. And the fourth is the purported increase in income tax that never was. So in all of those instances, the government took what might be seen as a brave decision, politically speaking, to make a policy change, then reversed in full or part that policy change and just invited grief. I mean, this is terrible politics. It shows that Keir Starmer has dreadful political instincts. It also suggests that there is some kind of problem with the political aptitude of those advising the Prime Minister, although ultimately the Prime Minister has to take responsibility for this. And at the moment, I see no evidence that Keir Starmer has done anything to stop this problem. I mean, the reversal on the partial reversal on placing inheritance tax on agricultural properties was only announced in the last week or two. In fact, was it announced, the 23rd of December?
Yeah, 2 days before Christmas.
2 days before Christmas. So this policy, which had invited huge protests in central London of all of these farmers on their tractors and so on, and they got all this kind of attention. We live in the countryside, and we've seen loads of signs about Keir Starmer's family farm tax, so-called. And I actually think there are good grounds for the policy, to be honest. I do think that farms have been used as a form of tax avoidance, and there's maybe the policy could have been designed in a better way. But basically, the government has recognized that it probably set the threshold too low. It's listened to the farmers and the campaigners, and it's probably going to get no political credit for doing this. And it's going to be remembered in the minds of many rural voters as a government that is anti-farmer, just in the way that it's been remembered in the minds of pensioners as being anti-pensioner, just as it's been remembered from the eyes of the left as being anti working class families, just as it's been remembered in the eyes of income earners as anti people who go out to work. And in all of these cases, the government's tried to reverse course, but it actually, in the end, won't get any credit. So this is sort of almost pathological, it seems, as an approach to governance of the current Labour government. And unless Starmer does something drastic, or Starmer himself goes, which would be really another preference of mine, 2026, I think, will just continue to be a bad year for Labour, because this is not just bad luck. This is like structural to the way that the government is approaching policy making and politics. And it's really, really bad for the government to do this.
I think the other thing, which is a sign of this government now, or the hallmark of this government really, is to make itself deeply unpopular with things that are basically fiddling around the edges. So, for example, there are some people within the Labour Party who will make a big argument about intergenerational inequality and how the current cohort of pensioners, when taken as a big group, have done very well from being part of their generation. And they would sometimes make the arguments about changing the winter fuel payment criteria in those terms. But if you're going to make that big argument, you really ought to have a big answer to it. And instead, their answer brought in next to no money and then was pretty much undone. And I say this isn't my view as such, but if you're to make yourself really unpopular with pensioners, then you may as well do it to a very significant end. I have a policy goal in mind, whether that's something like merging income tax and national insurance so that pensioners pay the same rates of tax when you combine those two as working age people do. Again, I'm not advocating for that necessarily, but that would be a major revenue raiser, a big change to the tax system. It would upset a great deal of pensioners, but well, you've done that anyway. And it's rather the same with, I spoke about this on the podcast around the time of the budget, things like council tax reform. If you're to make, as Rachel Reeves did in the budget, a big argument about the unfairness of the modern council tax system, an argument I happen to agree with, introduce and announce comprehensive council tax reform. Don't do this kind of fiddly mansion tax that's barely going to raise anything and affect hardly anybody around the fringes. You've got to take on the problems in a more substantive way than that. And so the thing which, if I was in the Labour Party, I'd be most depressed about is that the government's become breathtakingly unpopular with huge swathes of the country for very little upside. And in fact, you hear this when you sometimes see in the last year Labour MPs try and say, oh, well, here are all of the great things that we're doing in government. And there are some things that I'm sure they're very proud of, things like breakfast clubs, etc., which will benefit people, and I know that there'll be people who are very attached to that. But in the grand scheme of government spending, it's tiny. It's a really small part of the education budget that is going towards helping a certain group of people. If you believe in doing more of that, great. But it's really not the sort of thing that a massive majority Labour government, after 14 years in opposition, really ought to have made the summit of its achievements. But issues like that, relatively small ones, do tend to be the things that they obsess about highlighting as their achievements.
Because also, ultimately in politics, you're not going to have policies that please everyone. And there are winners and losers to pretty much every policy. The trick is to be able to give a sufficient number of people good reasons for why those policies are being pursued, not least to be able to equip them and arm them to defend those policies intellectually, morally, economically. And that's what's missing in this government, is actually just the basics of what this government is for, who's it for, what's it trying to do, what's this all actually about. And part of that is because we've had a kind of suppression of thinking. I mean, I'll put it as bluntly as that, within the Labour Party under the Starmer leadership, where it's almost been forbidden to express ideas within the Labour Party. At least that ideas are dangerous and ideas can be misinterpreted and so on. And it's also symptomatic of a mindset that we got into, and I say Labour got into when we were in opposition, which is we don't need to do the hard thinking. We don't need to really assess what we're about, because the Tories are just messing up left, right and centre, and we'll just wait for the prize to land in our lap. But we're a bit like the dog that caught the car after yapping and yapping and yapping at the car, and now we don't know what to do with it. And again, ultimately, blame for that lies with Keir Starmer.
Absolutely. And if we're looking ahead, I don't see that changing really whilst he's at the top of the Labour Party or the top of the government. Two quick final things. I wanted to say something actually which cheered me up a little bit in the last year. So I think social media has, since its introduction and its mass adoption and then its heyday perhaps, become rather grim in recent years. AI videos, extreme opinions, huge numbers of adverts rather than actually seeing people you're friends with or intend to follow. I think using social media is now a pretty miserable experience, unless you follow our Instagram page, of course. But something which actually gave me a bit of cause for cheer in the last year was what I think we saw on Twitter, or X as it now is, in terms of people who committed huge amounts of time and energy to scrutinizing one particular piece of legislation, which is the assisted dying bill. and really shining a spotlight on what is in the bill, some of the challenges. I think in particular of people like Nikita Costa, Philip Murray, who's an academic in Cambridge, Rajiv Shah and Yuan Yi Zhu, among others, who have really done a great deal of work, I think, on that and have added enormously, really, to certainly my knowledge, but I think the public's knowledge of what is in the bill and how the debate has gone, which in an era when we don't have parliamentary pages in newspapers anymore, and there's plenty of people still working in journalism, of course, but you don't necessarily get rewarded in our modern media ecosystem for long, detailed, thoughtful explanations about the parliamentary passage of a private member's bill, so much as you do for the showy, headline grabbing items of news. I think there have been people who have on social media shown the strength of platforms like X. And yes, all of the misery around it, of course, is still there. There's still loads of reasons why I'd be much better off going for a walk, picking up a book, or doing almost anything aside from going on X on your phone. But I think they have shown some of the benefit of social media in a way which I hadn't actually really seen in quite a long time. Richard, what was your final thought to wrap us up?
So I began this episode by talking about the dramatic image of Rachel Reeves streaming in tears on the Treasury bench in July. Another image that has struck me in 2025 is the almost what you would call the survivor's photo of the last hereditary peers in the House of Lords. One of the few but regrettable constitutional changes of the current Labour government this year has been to put through legislation that will kick out the remaining 92 hereditary members of the House of Lords. Now, we've talked about this in an earlier episode on the House of Lords, but basically the core point about the hereditary peers is that although they're indefensible in theory, they are quite defensible in practice. And that's true of so many elements of the British Constitution. But what the hereditary peers do in practice is a few things that I think is just worth reflecting on. The first is that among the Lords Temporal, the non-bishop peers, they are the only peers that aren't chosen by a committee of, let's face it, people who are of a kind of civil service mindset, or by the party leadership, by the executive and the party leaders. And that gives them a certain independence, both from party patronage, but also a certain independence from a kind of civil service mindset, which I think is not brilliant, not very, it has its problems for sure in British politics. And I think that's a valuable contribution that they make. And I think the second thing to say about the hereditary peers is that as a result of the Blair reforms on the hereditaries, where it was shrunk down to just 92 of the eligible hundreds and hundreds of hereditary peers who can actually take up a seat in the House of Lords, and that they're chosen through a by-election process by other members of the hereditary peers. This process of peer review, if you'll excuse the expression, ensures that actually you get people who sit in the House of Lords through the hereditary peer route who are recognized by others as people who are going to have something interesting to say, worthwhile to say, perhaps something challenging to say, but again are not chosen by people who themselves have been put there through patronage or by some kind of civil service committee, like the House of Lords Appointment Committee. And given that we have a very large House of Lords, which I think is also a good thing, they were never such a critical mass that they ever posed any true problems, I think, for the functioning of the House of Lords. And it's just another example of constitutional reform for the sake of kind of theoretical purity and precision, rather than thinking about the practical effects that that will have. And this has just detracted from the House of Lords. It adds nothing and it takes away something. And I'll finish by just recommending a chapter in an edited volume that I edited in 2025 called Strengthening the Political Constitution. And in that, I have a chapter on the House of Lords written by the Earl Attlee, the third Earl Attlee, the grandson of Clement Attlee, the namesake or one of the namesakes of this podcast, where he reflects on his position as a hereditary member of the House of Lords and what he has tried to do in his now several decades as a member of the House of Lords. And I bumped into the Earl Attlee a few weeks ago in the House of Lords, and it was very sad for me to reflect that very likely this time next year he'll be gone, and that will bring an end to, in effect, 1,000 years, or certainly 700-800 years, centuries of British history. For what? For the sake of what I would almost call constitutional aesthetics, and making sure the Constitution looks good rather than thinking about how the Constitution actually functions. And that, I think, is not the way to approach constitutional reform. So I think it is a change that is much to be lamented. I'm sorry to end on that sad note. I don't know if you have any words to cheer us up and pick us up as we round off this episode, Lee.
Well, a final thought really is that the gift of history when you're thinking about constitutional issues is that you don't have to depend upon abstract reasoning alone. You have experience. And in the case of a country like the United Kingdom, you've got the experience of many, many centuries. But that seems to be the one thing which we almost never really factor in to the way in which we think about the Constitution. What is our experience of how it's worked under its current model in the past? And then also when changes are made, what is the experience of how they have worked and have they actually worked out or not? And so on the hereditary peers, for example, I think I fully accept that there are people, almost certainly a majority in the country, in fact, who do not think that people by birthright, even with the peer review process that you described, ought to have a seat in the House of Lords. I fully accept that. But before simply legislating to kick them out, it's at the very least worth asking, well, what useful thing do they contribute when they are there? And therefore not being too blinkered about whether or not that is, in theory, the right thing to have them there, or even if we take the view that it is so offensive to principle to have hereditary peers in the House of Lords, then to at least not be so dogmatic about that as to say that the people who are there at the moment do provide some value, and how do we therefore look at removing them in a way that manages to capture that value for a remaining period without simply kicking them out. So that is my great hope, maybe in the year to come, that we do think much more about history, about our own experience as a country, as well as the experience of other countries, about trying to structure and organize and govern your affairs, and not simply depend upon, as I think can sometimes be the case, vibes or aesthetics about the way in which a constitution or settlement or other issues in politics may work. Because actually, if you dig deep into our recent or longer past as a country, you can actually find good examples for almost any argument you wish to make, that you can make more interesting and more robust through history. And maybe that is something we can all take with us into 2026. Well, thank you for listening to this look back and look ahead of Since Attlee and Churchill. We'll be back on Sunday with the final instalment of our Heath versus Wilson elections mini-series, looking at the final of the quartet of contests that they fought against each other, the October 1974 general election. We'll see you then.
Thanks very much, and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.